I already told you that Pete McCloskey is a hero of the Korean War, where his role as a Marine rifle platoon leader, he received a Navy Cross, he received a Silver Star, and he was wounded twice and got 2 Purple Hearts. He wrote an absolutely fabulous book about this called Hill 610, which does not mention one word about the medals, and instead he talks about true stuff, like how scared he was, how much he loved the Marines around him, how brave they were, and how many of them were killed and wounded. He talks about the medics, what heroes they were. He talks about combat. But his modesty and humility cannot hide what his Marines thought of him. One PFC said, "I would follow Lieutenant McCloskey anywhere. I don't think there's a hill in Korea he couldn't take with a rifle platoon." That's pretty high praise. After Korea, Pete became a lawyer in Palo Alto, and for 7 terms, he was a Republican congressman from the peninsula, the area that we know as the Silicon Valley. Being a lawyer and a politician, however, did not unman him. He continued to be the bravest of the brave. He volunteered to serve as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. He volunteered to serve in Vietnam. They never called him up because I'm sure they didn't want a congressman to get that close to what was going on or to see what was going on. Then when Pete learned more about the war in 1969, he was the first person in Congress to start an effort to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And when that didn't work, in 1972, he challenged the sitting president in his own party. You may remember the name, Richard Nixon, just before Watergate, for the Republican presidential nomination. Would that he have won. Pete has been fighting good fights all his life. He helped start the environmental movement in this country, creating with Senator Gaylord Nelson Earth Day in 1970. He taught at Stanford. He taught at the Army War College, where he's tried cases. He's written books. He's served on national commissions. He has 4 great kids who serve other people. Pete is a farmer now, working with his wonderful wife, Helen, who's here tonight, on the family farm in Rumsey, Yolo County. And he's still fighting the good fights, working with his firm, Cachette, Petrie, and McCarthy, the law firm that is keeping open St. Martin's Beach in San Mateo County. Pete's colleagues are thoroughly in attendance down here tonight, so please help me welcome a hero, another hero, Pete McCloskey. Woo-hoo! Hey, brother.
All right. That introduction is unmanned me. Don't worry about a long speech because I'm kind of limited to 3 minutes. At the end of 3 minutes, my wife's going to give me the finger from the table down here. And I know that I'll cost my law firm, knowing their hourly rate per hour, about $50,000 if I talk more than 3 minutes. But I brought these papers because I had a couple of quotes, and I wanted to tell you. It's funny, I have 4 heroes right now. 2 of them are here tonight. John Kecker, who lost half an arm in Vietnam in the same battalion that I served in some years earlier in Korea. Joe Kachet, my principal partner here, who has never seen an injustice that he wouldn't take on, including the antitrust exemption for organized baseball, which John Kecker is representing. And I could make a lot of money selling tickets to when Joe Kecker and Joe Kachet and John Kecker come up against each other in court. It will be a display of combat that people ought to see to enjoy the fact that there's still justice in our courts. Whichever wins, there'll be justice. But two other heroes that I wanted to mention in my life. One is Max Cleland. And Max lost, as a platoon leader, we have sort of a platoon leaders club. Max lost both legs and an arm. And he had the courage to vote against the Iraq War and lose his seat in the Senate as a result. And those people that had the courage to vote against the war is what I wanted to say a few words tonight. And I brought this up here to read a quote to you. It is only those who have never heard a shot, never heard the shriek and the groans of the wounded and the desolate, that cry out for more blood, more vengeance, more desolation. War is hell. That was Tecumseh Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. And my concern, and I came here to honor you because what you do in Swords to Plowshares, I cannot conceive of a greater service than helping these kids who, starting back in 1974 when this organization, remember where young men came back from a year's service in Vietnam and were accused by students on colleges, how many babies did you kill today? And it's no wonder that people suffer the trauma of war and come back and have difficulty. We have a great deal of patriotism today and people who want to honor our servicemen. But think of the servicemen. In World War II, everybody served. In Korea, when I served, we thought we were fighting for the UN principle. But what about Iraq? What about Vietnam? If you look back at what got us into Vietnam, 4 men who had never had combat service, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Walt Rostow. None of them had been in combat, but they secretly met in February 1965 and decided to commit American troops to Vietnam. Iraq, years later, men who had never been in combat, never served. Don Rumsfeld had served, but George Bush had joined the National Guard to avoid combat. Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, men who had never been in combat, many of them who had dodged the draft, sent our young men into a war. And I think that there's a great benefit. I'll make one other quote from a man I respected highly. He was a young lieutenant, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., in the 20th Massachusetts. And he said, in our youth, we were privileged to be touched by fire. And that fire and serving under combat has created a collection of people who are very reluctant to see us to go to war. I tell you, I have some confidence today that our Secretary of Defense is a sergeant that was wounded twice in Vietnam. Our Secretary of State was wounded in the swift boats in the Delta in Vietnam. And I wish there were more people in the Congress that had had combat experience that would think twice before choosing war over negotiation and some other team. But I wanted to tell you my fourth hero who has done what Swords to Plowshares has done, is former Marine named Jim Wright, who was the president of Dartmouth College. And when these kids were getting terribly wounded and were suffering, as John Kecker did for a year in Bethesda Hospital, trying to make sure that they didn't take his arm off, Jim Wright, president of Dartmouth, goes down to Bethesda and interviews amputees and said, I want you to come to Dartmouth and get a great education. And so what Swords to Plowshares is doing can be no greater service. But let me say a few words and then I'll quit because my wife, have you given me the finger yet? Have I gone 3 minutes? I want to speak about love. because love is a thing that holds us all together. It gets us through despair and disappointment, losses, grief. Love is a wonderful thing, which is what Swords to Plowshares is doing for veterans. It's extending love to them. But think a little about that 1% that bear the burden of our foreign policy. I don't worry about the Air Force. I don't worry about the Navy. But that thin line of infantrymen, the boots on the ground, that everybody wants to praise, those kids that come from small towns and barrios and farms and the worst parts of our urban society. Think of those kids. How do you get love in your life of a good woman if every year you're sent for 7 months to some far-off place? One deployment, fine. Maybe 2 deployments. But John served in a war that came home after 13 months. I served in a war. We came home for a year. These kids in the National Guard are subject to being deployed 3, 4, 5 times. How can you have love with your family, your wife, your kids? How can you have that love? And so I wanted to make a proposal to you tonight, because I don't like to speak unless I can say something outrageous like, I have a thought. I introduced the National Service Bill back in 1979. It would have passed until Reagan said he'd veto it. But George Bush Sr. picked it up, made me chairman of his Commission on National Service. And here's my thought. We need, again, to have the decision makers that decide whether to go to war or not. If they haven't got combat experience, I think their sons ought to be exposed to that possibility. And so, my proposal is very simple. Those planners at the Pentagon, when they're planning ahead 5 years of how many people we're going to deploy to Australia or anywhere in the Mideast, or Iran, or wherever, I'd say let's include in that planning the concept of reinstituting the selective service system. And out of every major university, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, USC, that we draft enough of the sons of wealthy men to match so that no enlisted men ever have to serve more than 2 tours of duty again. And I say that because in my time in the Congress, we had 21 Marines in the House, 8 in the Senate. You look at the Congress today, and you just hope some of these young kids coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan that suffer those mental fears that all of us had then and have continued, that some of them will get into the high positions of government instead of people who have never heard the scream or the terror of machine gun fire, grenades, artillery going off. And so that's my proposal, that we look forward and try to get into our government of the United States leaders who have either had combat experience or whose sons. My thought is about after your sophomore year at Columbia or Yale or Princeton or Stanford, you get drafted for 2 years into the infantry. It takes a year to train a man to serve in combat. Another year he's available for combat. So these kids that are volunteering to now never have to lose their families or their love, because love still is the greatest thing of all. Thank you.